Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the iPhone 5C and see how this particular phone holds up in 2025. Now, I think the iPhone 5C is just an interesting phone. It's like so hard for me to say this type of phone name, but the thing I will tell you is that a lot of people probably assume this phone is not worth buying, and you would be 100% right. But the legacy of the 5C is probably more than you'd ever think about, and I will tell you there's definitely way better phones to pick up, but I think the 5C still has a special place in my heart for the most part. But if you do want to go ahead and pick up some phones that I would recommend buying this year, links will be down in the description below. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the exact same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the iPhone 5C, on the front side of this particular iPhone, you are getting a 4-inch IPS LCD panel. Now, this type of panel and this type of phone came out in 2013. The reason why that's important is because this was a year after the iPhone 5 came out, and this was the same time the iPhone 5S had came out. So kind of think about it from that perspective. You're getting this type of phone, right? It's a year after the iPhone 5, and you're getting basically the same size display and the same type of display as an iPhone 5S. So you might think to yourself, wow, that's like a pretty good deal in and of itself. Like that's a pretty nice thing to be able to do there, right? Now that's one way to kind of think about it. Another thing here was that on the front side of this phone, you were getting a pretty big bezel at the top and a pretty big bezel on the bottom. So that home button on the front side really wasn't necessarily like the best type of panel of all time. It was, kind of this, okay type of display, but that's kind of what Apple was doing at that time. They didn't increase the size of the display until one generation after. So I will still tell you for the most part, this type of phone still looks pretty decent for a 2013 device, but the iPhone 5S had Touch ID on the front side. The iPhone 5C only had this regular standard home button. So that right there was kind of another downside for this type of phone too. Like you were going to go through and pick up this type of phone, but unfortunately with the iPhone 5C, you were basically going to go through and pick up a phone that was not giving you that type of, home button. It wasn't giving you that type of fingerprint sensor. So that could be a very big disadvantage for a lot of people. And I will tell you, for me, I didn't even own a phone that had a fingerprint sensor at that time, but it would have been really nice had I had it. On the bottom, you were getting a lightning port, which was still really nice to have. I love having lightning, and you were getting that here as well. On the back side, you were getting these two kind of like glass shards on the top and the bottom, which were really nice. I think that was a really cool thing going on there too. And then you were getting, now on the back of this phone, this is where things got really, really interesting. So the iPhone 5C was basically giving you this plastic back. I think this is one of the last iPhones to ever bring a plastic back. I know some of the earlier generations brought plastic pieces, but this thing was completely plastic. And this was the biggest controversial thing with this particular iPhone. The reason why Apple decided to put a plastic back inside of this phone was because this was supposed to be a cheaper phone. This was supposed to be a cheaper option for a lot of people out there. It was not supposed to be this like super expensive phone to compete with the 5S. It was supposed to be a cheaper option. If you didn't want to go buy the 5S, at least there was another phone out there that you could also buy, and you can kind of like save some money with as well. So that was the biggest reason why this phone, it was kind of controversial. I liked it though. I thought that was kind of cool, but the fact that the fingerprint sensor thing was more of an issue for me than the back of this phone. Now, the naming convention is also something interesting, because now when you take a look at a lot of phones, you take a look at the iPhone SE, the iPhone 16e, this iPhone was kind of the one that kind of originated that type of lineup, from the naming structure from Apple. So I don't think Apple would have ever made an iPhone SE if it wasn't for the 5C, and I don't think Apple would make an iPhone 16e, that type of naming convention that took off in a lot of other places, if it wasn't for the iPhone 5C either. So it's a really, really interesting thing, but that kind of in and of itself is a super interesting thing when you take a look at the outside. So from that perspective, that kind of covers it up there too. Now, when it does kind of come down to the camera on this thing was essentially the same exact type of layout as the iPhone 5. So this was always something that was very, very interesting, because if you're taking a look at this type of phone, you would have basically seen that this type of device was essentially giving you a very similar type of layout as something like an iPhone 5. So this iPhone 5C was giving you that 1080p at 30 on the back and 720p on the front. So this is in and of itself another really cool type of lineup to have. For the most part, it works really well. A lot of people are going to be able to go through and use this type of phone and basically have a really good time with it, right? For back in 2013. But the thing here, as I mentioned before, and kind of the downside was that it was the same kind of camera as the iPhone 5. And why would you go ahead and want to buy this phone at that point? Why not just go and buy something like an iPhone 5, right? That's kind of the biggest takeaway that you could think about when you're going to get this phone. Nowadays, Nowadays, we have things that have like 4K at 60 and 8K capability, so this phone is already outdated by that point. But this phone was a decent camera at that point, but it was just the same exact thing as the iPhone 5. So that right there was another one of those minor things to kind of keep in mind there too. Now, on top of that, when it comes down to their software longevity, this is probably one of the biggest issues you're going to be experiencing within this type of phone. So when it kind of comes down to this day and age, you're going to have to remember the iPhone 5C is outdated with software, and it has been outdated with software for years now. So for many, many years, this phone hasn't gotten a single software update. So because of that, that puts us in another situation where it genuinely just does not make any sense to go through and buy this type of phone. And this phone is already kind of outdated when it somewhat kind of comes down to it. And it makes a lot more sense to go ahead and maybe buy a different type of device that will still give you software updates. So, like I said, there's a lot of other options out there for you, and this one is already outdated, so I'd hate for you to go and buy this phone from that perspective. Even the battery life, 1510 mAh battery, that is a pretty, once again, outdated type of battery size to get inside of this phone. And like I said before, I would genuinely hate for you to go ahead and buy this type of device if it's already outdated with software. Like I said, there's so many other options out there for you to go and buy, and this one really isn't one of those types of devices that I would highly recommend just not purchasing, in my opinion. Finally, when it comes down to the performance, this phone was giving you the Apple A6 chip inside of it with 1GB of RAM. So this is one of those other things to keep in mind here. 1GB of RAM back in 2013, that was pretty decent, right? It was giving you a pretty decent experience. Nowadays, as you can probably imagine, that really is not that great of a performing type of camera anymore. That's a pretty big downside there. That's not necessarily that great of a performing camera. So there are significantly better types of cameras to go and buy rather than this thing. So that is in and of itself one of those other big, massive things to keep in mind there too, because there are significantly better options. Like this phone's performance just isn't really that good, but it's not terrible either if you're thinking about it through the lens of a 2013 phone. But if you're looking at it in the lens of like a current generation device, clearly this thing is fairly outdated when it comes down to it, and that's just kind of what ends up happening when you're going to go through and pick up these types of phones. So once again, not the biggest deal in the world, but it is one of those things you're probably going to end up experiencing when you're going to go through and pick up one of these types of devices. So overall, what I can definitely tell you is that the iPhone 5C is one of those types of phones that I genuinely probably, it's an interesting phone to say the least, but it really isn't a device that I'd recommend people to buy anymore. This is one of those types of phones that definitely has its own fair share of issues. I think it has its own problems, and there are significantly better devices to go and buy rather than this one, right? So if you want to buy it as a collector's item, then go for it. But for pretty much everyone else, there's way better devices to go and go out there and buy. Number one, I think an iPhone 12 is a decent device this year. I think an iPhone 13 is also a pretty decent option too. So those are kind of the better ones here. Otherwise, there's a lot of other devices you can buy rather than this one. So that kind of covers it up here. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that'll mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.